Mr. Scott? No. Ms. Cantwell. Ms. Cantwell, aye. Mrs. McCaskill. Mrs. McCaskill, aye. Mr. Rockefeller. Mr. Rockefeller, aye.
Does any senator wish to vote or change their vote? If not, the yeas are 54, the nays are 41, and the nomination is confirmed.
Madam President.
Assistant Majority Leader.
Madam President, would you please bring the Senate to order?
The Senate will come to order.
Madam President, I ask unanimous consent the remaining mandatory quorums with respect to these nominations required under Rule 22 be waived. Further, that all remaining votes be 10-minute votes. I urge my colleagues to stay on the floor so we can hold to these 10-minute deadlines. People have planes to catch.
Is there objection? Without objection. The clerk will report the motion to invoke cloture.
Cloture motion. We, the undersigned senators, in accordance with the provisions of Rule 22 of the Standing Rules of the Senate, hereby move to bring to a close the debate on the nomination of John Andrew Koskinen of the District of Columbia to be Commissioner of Internal Revenue, signed by 19 senators.
By unanimous consent, the mandatory quorum call has been waived. The question is it the sense of the Senate that debate on the nomination of John Andrew Koskinen of the District of Columbia to be Commissioner of Internal Revenue shall be brought to a close? The yeas and nays are mandatory under the rule. The clerk will call the roll.
Mr. Alexander, Ms. Ayotte, Ms. Baldwin, Mr. Barrasso, Mr. Baucus, Mr. Begich, Mr. Bennett, Mr. Blumenthal, Mr. Blunt,
Cloture.
Mr. Booker, Mr. Bozeman, Mrs. Boxer, Mr. Brown, Mr. Burr, Ms. Cantwell, Mr. Cardin, Mr. Carper, Mr. Casey, Mr. Chambliss, Mr. Coates, Mr. Coburn, Mr. Cochran, Ms. Collins, Mr. Coons, Mr. Corker, Mr. Cornyn, Mr. Crapo, Mr. Cruz, Mr. Donnelly, Mr. Durbin, Mr. Enzi, Mrs. Feinstein, Mrs. Fisher, Mr. Flake, Mr. Franken, Mrs. Gillibrand, Mr. Graham, Mr. Grassley, Mrs. Hagan, Mr. Harkin, Mr. Hatch, Mr. Heinrich, Ms. Heitkamp, Mr. Heller, Ms. Hirono, Mr. Hoven, Mr. Inhofe, Mr. Isaacson, Mr. Johans, Mr. Johnson of Wisconsin, Mr. Johnson of South Dakota, Mr. Kane, Mr. King, Mr. Kirk, Ms. Klobuchar, Ms. Landrieu, Mr. Leahy, Mr. Lee, Mr. Levin, Mr. Manchin. Mr. Markey. Mr. McCain. Mrs. McCaskill. Mr. McConnell. Mr. Menendez. Mr. Merkley. Ms. Mikulski. Mr. Moran. Ms. Murkowski. Mr. Murphy. Mrs. Murray. Mr. Nelson. Mr. Paul. Mr. Portman. Mr. Pryor.
And the semester will already
Mr. Reed of Rhode Island. Mr. Reed of Nevada. Mr. Risch. Mr. Roberts. Mr. Rockefeller, Mr. Rubio, Mr. Sanders, Mr. Schatz, Mr. Schumer, Mr. Scott, Mr. Sessions, Mrs. Shaheen, Mr. Shelby, Ms. Stabenow.
She's right away.
Mr. Tester, Mr. Thune, Mr. Toomey, Mr. Udall of Colorado, Mr. Udall of New Mexico, Mr. Vitter, Mr. Warren, Ms. Warren, Mr. Whitehouse, Mr. Wicker, Mr. Wyden. Senators voting in the affirmative: Baldwin, Baucus, Begich, Blumenthal, Booker, Brown, Cantwell, Cardin, Carper, Casey, Collins, Coons, Donnelly, Durbin, Feinstein, Franken, Gillibrand, Hagan, Harkin, Hatch, Heinrich, Heitkamp, Hirono, Johnson of South Dakota, Kane, King, Klobuchar, Landrieu, Leahy, Manchin, Markey, McCaskill, Menendez, Merkley, Mikulski, Murphy, Murray, Nelson, Pryor, Reed of Rhode Island, Rockefeller, Schatz, Schumer, Stabenow, Tester, Udall of New Mexico, Warner, Warren, Whitehouse, Wyden. Mr. Sanders, aye. Senators voting in the negative: Barrasso, Blunt, Bozeman, Burr, Chambliss, Coates, Coburn, Cochran, Cornyn, Crapo, Cruz, Enzi, Fisher, Graham, Heller, Hoeven, Inhofe, Johnson of Wisconsin, Kirk, Lee, McCain, McConnell, Moran, Murkowski, Hall, Portman, Risch, Roberts, Rubio, Scott, Sessions, Shelby, Toomey, Vitter, Wicker. Mrs. Shaheen, aye. Mr. Thune, no. Mr. Udall of Colorado, aye. Mrs. Boxer, aye. Mr. Levin, aye. Mr. Bennett, aye. Mr. Grassley, no. Miss Ayotte, no. Mr. Corker, no.
Does any senator wish to vote or change their vote? If not, the ayes are 56, the nays are 39, and the nomination is confirmed.
The motion is agreed to. I'm sorry. The motion,
President,
Stand corrected, the motion is agreed to. The clerk will report the nomination.
Nomination, Department of the Treasury.
The Senate will come to order.
Madam President,
Assistant Majority Leader.
Madam President, that 10-minute roll call took 18 minutes. If people will stay on the floor, we can move through these more quickly.
The clerk will report the nomination.
Department of the Treasury, John Andrew Koskinen of the District of Columbia to be Commissioner of Internal Revenue.
Under the previous order, all post-cloture time is yielded back, and the question occurs on the nomination. Is there sufficient?
you guys going to...
The yeas and nays have been called for. Is there a sufficient second? Clerk will... There appears to be. The clerk will call the roll.
Mr. Alexander, Ms. Ayat, Ms. Baldwin, Mr. Barrasso, Mr. Baucus, Mr. Begich, Mr. Bennett. Yes, sir, gotcha.
Hey, Gary.
Mr. Blunt. Carper. Mr. Booker. Shelby. Mr. Bozeman.
Come on, man.
Mrs. Boxer. Mr. Brown. Mr. Burr. Ms. Cantwell. Mr. Cardin. No, gotcha. Schumer. Stabenow. Gotcha.
For anybody who wants to walk somewhere downstairs. All right, Grace, could you take us to S139? No, S138. Do that.
Sure. Mr. Carper. Mr. Casey. Sir. Mr. Chambliss, Mr. Coates, Mr. Coburn. Mr. Cochran. Ms. Collins. Gotcha. And you're on.
Hey, Dean.
Gotcha.
Like
White
the
House.
last nom we just did, was the president immediately notified? Is that the consent?
Mr. Coons.
We'll do it all before we yell in.
Mr. Corker. Mr. Cornyn. Mr. Crapo.
Okay, but they're all going to be, they're all
Mr. Cruz. Sir.
Okay. Thank you.
Mr. Donnelly. Mr. Durbin.
Donald, Ms. Donald. Yes.
I got you. Okay. Mr. Enzi, Mrs. Feinstein. Shots. Mrs. Fisher. Mr. Flake, Mr. Franken. Mrs. Gillibrand. Mr. Graham, Mr. Grassley. Mrs. Hagan. Mr. Harkin. Mr. Hatch. Mr. Heinrich. Ms. Heitkamp. Mr. Heller. Ms. Hirono. Mr. Hoven. Mr. Inhofe, Mr. Isaacson, Mr. Johans, Mr. Johnson of Wisconsin, Mr. Johnson of South Dakota, Mr. Kane, Mr. King, Mr. Kirk. Are you ready? You know? Yes, sir, it says. Ms. Klobuchar, Ms. Landrieu, Mr. Leahy, Mr. Lee, Mr. Levin, Mr. Manchin, Mr. Markey, Mr. McCain, Mrs. McCaskill, Mr. McConnell, Mr. Menendez, Mr. Merkley, Ms. Mikulski, Mr. Moran, Ms. Murkowski, Mr. Murphy, Mrs. Murray, Mr. Nelson, Mr. Paul, Mr. Portman, Mr. Pryor, Mr. Reed of Rhode Island, Mr. Reed of Nevada, Mr. Risch, Mr. Roberts, Mr. Rockefeller, Mr. Rubio, Mr. Sanders, Mr. Schatz, Mr. Schumer, Mr. Scott, Mr. Sessions, Mrs. Shaheen, Mr. Shelby, Ms. Stabenow, Mr. Tester, Mr. Thune, Mr. Toomey, Mr. Udall of Colorado, Mr. Udall of New Mexico, Mr. Vitter, Mr. Warner, Ms. Warren, Mr. Whitehouse, Mr. Wicker, Mr. Wyden, Kane. Senators voting in the affirmative. Baldwin, Bennett, Blumenthal, Booker, Boxer, Brown, Burr, Cantwell, Carper, Casey, Collins, Corker, Donnelly, Durbin, Feinstein, Hatch, Hirono, Johnson of South Dakota, Kane, Landrieu, Leahy, Levin, Manchin, McCaskill, Merkley, Mikulski, Murphy, Murray, Nelson, Portman, Pryor, Reed of Rhode Island, Rockefeller, Sanders, Schatz, Schumer, Stabenow, Tester, Toomey, Udall of New Mexico, Warren, and Whitehouse. Mr. Menendez. Mr. Menendez. Aye. Mr. Cardin. Mr. Cardin. Aye. Mr. Wyden. Mr. Wyden. Aye. Senators voting in the negative. Barrasso, Blunt, Bozeman, Chambliss, Coates, Coburn, Cochran, Cornyn, Crapo, Cruz, Enzi, Graham, Heller, Inhofe, Kirk, Lee, McCain, McConnell, Moran, Murkowski, Paul, Risch, Roberts, Scott, Shelby, Vitter, and Wicker. Mr. Markey. Mr. Markey, aye. Ms. Warren. Aye. Oh, I had you vote. Mrs. Fisher, no. Ms. Heitkamp, aye. Mr. Udall. Mr. Udall, aye. Ms. Ayotte, no. Ms. Klobuchar. Ms. Klobuchar, aye. Mr. Harkin. Mr. Harkin, aye. Mr. Schumer. Mr. Schumer, aye.
It's going to be that way all day. People vote.
Mrs. Hagan, aye. Mr. Heinrich, aye. Mr. Begich. Mr. Begich, aye. Mr. Rubio, no. Mr. Johnson of Wisconsin, no. Mrs. Gillibrand. Mrs. Gillibrand, aye. Mr. King. Mr. King, aye. Mr. Thune, no. Mr. Franken, aye. Mr. Hoven. Mr. Hoven, no. Mr. Sessions, no. Mr. Grassley. Mr. Grassley, no. Mr. Warner, aye. Mr. Toomey, no. Mr. Coons, aye. Mr. Baucus, aye. Mrs. Shaheen, aye. We're ready.
Yeah, those mailing ones. Oh,
God darn it. I can't count.
We'll show you one day. We'll look it up.
Senate will come to order. On this vote, the yeas are 59, the nays are 36, and the nomination is confirmed.
Madam President,
Assistant Majority Leader.
last roll call was 11 and a half minutes. Thank you all for your cooperation.
The clerk will report the motion to invoke cloture.
Cloture motion, we the undersigned senators, in accordance with the provisions of Rule 22 of the Standing Rules of the Senate, hereby move to bring to a close the debate on the nomination of Brian J. Davis of Florida to be United States District Judge for the Middle District of Florida, signed by 19 senators.
By unanimous consent, the mandatory quorum call has been waived. The question is it the sense of the Senate that debate on the nomination Brian J. Davis of Florida to be United States District Judge for the Middle District of Florida shall be brought to a close? The yeas and nays are mandatory under the rule. The clerk will call the roll.
Mr. Alexander, Mr. Barrasso, Ms. Baldwin, Duchy.
No.
Mr. Begich, Mr. Bennett. Mr. Blumenthal.
Coach, no. No.
Mr. Blunt. Mr. Booker. Mr. Bozeman. Mrs. Boxer. Mr. Brown. Mr. Burr. Ms. Cantwell.
We went there 4 years ago. Everybody I know that's ever gone to
Mr. Cardin. Mr. Carper.
just one vote no. I think I have.
Mr. Casey. Mr. Chambliss. Mr. Coates. Mr. Coburn. Mr. Cochran. Ms. Collins.
I would like to go.
You'll take it to the girls if they're
How old are your girls? Yeah, well, the 5-year-old might be able to. They do a little stuff with them, right? Really? 3-year-old? No.
Mr. Coons. Mr. Corker. Mr. Cornyn. Mr. Crapo. Mr. Cruz. Mr. Donnelly. Mr. Durbin. Mrs. Feinstein. Mrs. Fisher. Mr. Flake. Mr. Franken. Mrs. Gillibrand, Mr. Graham, Mr. Grassley, Mrs. Hagan, Mr. Harkin. Mr. Hatch, Mr. Heinrich. Ms. Heitkamp. Mr. Heller. Ms. Hirono. Mr. Hoven, Mr. Inhofe. Mr. Isaacson. Mr. Johans, Mr. Johnson of Wisconsin. Mr. Johnson of South Dakota. Mr. Kane, Mr. King, Mr. Kirk, Ms. Klobuchar, Ms. Landrieu, Mr. Leahy, Mr. Lee, Mr. Levin, Mr. Manchin, Mr. Markey, Mr. McCain, Mrs. McCaskill, Mr. McConnell, Mr. Menendez, Mr. Merkley, Ms. Mikulski, Mr. Moran, Ms. Murkowski, Mr. Murphy, Mrs. Murray, Mr. Nelson, Mr. Paul, Mr. Portman, Mr. Pryor, Mr. Reed of Rhode Island, Mr. Reed of Nevada, Mr. Risch, Mr. Roberts, Mr. Rockefeller, Mr. Rubio, Mr. Sanders, Mr. Schatz, Mr. Schumer,
Did you see where the DHS is taking on a bill that basically said a 1-year transition because they affordable health care? We're going piece by piece. We're going to do
Mr. Scott,
press release.
Mr. Sessions, Mrs. Shaheen, Mr. Shelby, Ms. Stabenow, Mr. Tester, Mr. Thune, Mr. Toomey, Mr. Udall of Colorado, Mr. Udall of New Mexico, Mr. Vitter, Mr. Warner, Ms. Warren, Mr. Whitehouse, Mr. Wicker, Mr. Wyden, Senators voting in the affirmative: Baldwin, Baucus, Begich, Bennett, Blumenthal, Booker, Boxer, Cantwell, Cardin, Carper, Casey, Collins, Coons, Donnelly, Durbin, Franken, Gillibrand, Hagan, Harkin, Heinrich, Heitkamp, Hirono, Johnson of South Dakota, Kane, Klobuchar, Landrieu, Leahy, Levin, Manchin, Markey, McCaskill, Menendez, Merkley, Mikulski, Murkowski, Murphy, Murray, Nelson, Pryor, Reed of Rhode Island, Rockefeller, Sanders, Schatz, Schumer, Shaheen, Stabenow, Tester, Udall of New Mexico, Warner, Warren, Whitehouse. Mr. Wyden, aye. Senators voting in the negative: Ayotte, Barrasso, Blunt, Bozeman, Burr, Coates, Cochran, Corker, Cornyn, Crapo, Cruz, Enzi, Fisher, Graham, Grassley, Hoeven, Inhofe, Johnson of Wisconsin, Kirk, McCain, Moran, Paul, Portman, Risch, Roberts, Rubio, Scott, Sessions, Shelby, Thune, Toomey, Bitter, Wicker. Mr. Heller, no. Mr. Brown, aye. Mr. Udall, Colorado, aye. Mr. Lee, no. Mr. King, aye. Mrs. Feinstein, aye. Mr. McConnell. Mr. McConnell, no.
Votes. If not, the yeas are 56, the nays are 36.
Senators responded present.
2 senators responding present.
The motion is agreed to.
The motion is agreed to. The clerk will report the nomination.
Brian J. Davis of Florida to be United States District Judge for the Middle District.
Under the previous order, all post-cloture time is yielded back, and the question occurs on the nomination. Yeas and nays have been asked for. Is there a sufficient second? There appears to be. The clerk will call the roll.
Mr. Alexander. Ms. Ayotte. Ms. Baldwin. Mr. Barrasso. Mr. Baucus. Mr. Beckich. Mr. Bennett. Mr. Blumenthal. Mr. Blunt. Mr. Booker.
My family's all coming to me this
Mr. Bozeman. Mrs. Boxer. Mr. Brown. Mr. Burr. Ms. Cantwell.
One more.
Mr. Cardin. Mr. Carper. Mr. Casey. Mr. Chambliss. Mr. Coates.
She's right in the middle of the vote. I mean, seriously.
Mr. Coburn. Mr. Cochran. Ms. Collins.
King, aye. I mean, Kane, aye.
Mr. Coons. Mr. Corker. Mr. Cornyn. Mr. Crapo. Mr. Cruz. Mr. Donnelly. Mr. Durbin. Mr. Enzi. Mrs. Feinstein. Mrs. Fisher. Mr. Flake. Mr. Franken. Mrs. Gillibrand. Mr. Graham.
Chambliss and
Mr. Grassley. Mrs. Hagan. Mr. Harkin. Mr. Hatch. Mr. Heinrich. Thank you. 2 ayes. Love your baseball. Ms. Heitkamp. Aye. Mr. Heller. Mr. Rono. Thank you. Mr. Hoven. Mr. Inhofe. Mr. Isaacson. Mr. Johans. Mr. Johnson of Wisconsin. Mr. Johnson of South Dakota. Mr. Kane. Mr. King.